Hey, thank you very much, Julie. I want to acknowledge all of her efforts to create these wonderful programs. And I see some familiar faces, some new faces. I want to thank all of you for being here today because if you didn't show up, I'd actually have no reason to be here. So thank you all. And what we're going to do today is talk about the Akedah, the binding of Isaac from the book of Genesis. And just to put it in context, it is one of the most jarring narratives in the book of Genesis. Okay? When you think of it, God instructs Abraham to take his son, his only son Isaac, to the top of Mount Moriah, and then he sort of changes his mind later. He sort of rescinds his command, and the way we often tell the story is that it demonstrates Abraham's resolve to carry out God's will. And so many people have such a reaction to that. It's like, my son, my kid don't like that idea. Like you're going to listen to God by taking your kid and you're willing to sacrifice him. I mean, granted, after we got a van, we couldn't lock the kids in the trunk anymore. It was much harder, but that's still very different than that was a joke, by the way. That was very different than taking your kids up, to the top of the mountain and sacrificing him. So the way the story unfolds is that Abraham passes the test with flying colors because a ram appears instead of his son being sacrificed. And I just want to ask, how long ago did you first learn this story? Somebody tell me, like, when. I want somebody to put up their hand. When did you first learn this story? Julia, you can't. Okay, Robert Septon has his hand up. Robert, I just asked you to unmute. Okay.
In my 20s, when I became more interested in Judaism, unfortunately, I didn't learn hardly anything in Hebrew school.
Okay. Anybody get it really young? Did anybody get this really young? Wendy, how old were you? You can just put up your hand and give us I gotta see if I can. You can unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you. I had to get permission to unmute. Yeah, I think I was at Hebrew Day School, maybe in third grade, fourth grade, just as one of the stories.
When you think of it, it's a weird story to teach an 8-year-old kid.
Yeah.
8, 9 years old is when you're in third grade. So it's part of our legacy, and it ends up being one of the most read pieces of Torah text. We read it every year during that cycle when we read about the Akedah, the binding of Isaac. We read it actually in a traditional service. It's read every day in the Shacharit, in the morning prayer, and then we read it on Rosh Hashanah, and it speaks about God's ability to intervene in our lives. That's sort of the Rosh Hashanah motif. But I'm going to do something very, very different today, okay? What I really want to do in our presentation here today is talk about the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, from the point of view of Isaac's experience. I'm going to do some interesting midrashim, some legendary texts that suggest that Isaac had a near-death experience on Mount Moriah. I'm going to talk about all of that. But first of all, before we do that, I want to do a blessing for Torah study. And what I want you to do, we're coming up to, this is the season of who shall live and who shall die. We read that in our liturgy. And also on Yom Kippur, we do Yizkor. And then on Shmini Atzeret, the last days of Sukkot, we do Yizkor, memorial prayer. It's traditional, I don't know if any of you know this, in the 30 days before Rosh Hashanah, it's traditional to go to the cemetery to visit the deceased relatives, as if to give your annual end of year report and to invite them. So it's also traditional to dedicate our Torah study for the zchut, for the merit of those who have died. So if we had a smaller group of people, it's great. Julie, you got over 100 people. You're doing the right thing with your publicity. Kol hakavod. Just hold in your heart who it is that you're thinking of that you want to you want to dedicate the merit of our study. And can you unmute everybody for just a moment as I invite people? This is the Rosh Hashanah story par excellence. I want to invite people to say aloud this blessing for Torah study. If we could do that on 3. 1, 2, 3, together. Baruch
Adonai,
Holy One of blessing, majesty of all time and space. Thank you for this opportunity.
Amen.
What are you watching?
I just love being able to hear all of that cacophony of voices that we now have to mute again.
Where's he from?
Somebody needs to get muted.
Okay, that's fair enough.
Mute everybody again. Okay, this is my professor outline. I'm going to talk about a mythic approach to Torah.
Let me have my phone.
Wait, Lucy Scarborough needs to be muted. Okay. We need to talk about the midrashic problem behind this. You'll see. I'm going to tell you that Yitzchak was 37. You think of him as a little high school boy. He was 37. And he had a near-death experience, a spiritual rebirth, healing in Gan Eden, and he came back into the world prepared for the next steps. And guess what? In some ways, what I'm going to suggest is where we are at this point in time, we're not quite being bound on the altar, but we're in some intermezzo phase. In June, we all thought we were going back out into the world as if this COVID-19 had ended. And now, how many of you are like looking around for the mask that you had hidden for a while? Okay, thank you, Julie, for right. So we're all, in a way, we're somewhere between the past and the future, and we're not exactly sure where we are. And I think there's something in the Akedah, in the binding of Isaac, that will help us think about where we are and where we're going. Okay, you with me so far? That's sort of what I want to talk about. So I want to give you, if for those of you who like to read about midrash, about Jewish legendary tradition, there's a wonderful book called The Last Trial by Sholem Spiegel, where he examines the texts, legends, and traditions about the binding of Isaac and weaves them together into a very different take on the Akedah. So that's what I'm going to do here. Okay. Julie, you get to read this first, okay? I want to talk about a mythic approach to Torah. This is from Maimonides. Go.
Every time that you find in our books a tale the reality of which seems impossible, a story which is repugnant to both reason and common sense, then be sure that the tale contains a profound allegory veiling a deeply mysterious truth, and the greater the absurdity of the letter, the deeper the wisdom of the spirit. Maimonides.
So that's Maimonides, and Maimonides is a rationalist. So what sometimes people get stuck in reading Torah literally. Did he really take him up on the mountain? Did he really? It's an allegory of something deeper. What's a myth? Anybody want to answer what a myth is? Somebody, Julie, you got to work quickly with these three pages of Hollywood squares.
Well, if you'd like to comment or respond, you can use the raise hand function, or let me know in the chat that you'd like to be unmuted.
Okay, can I call on somebody? Marilyn Gross, you've heard me teach. Oh, Zeb, well, come back, Marilyn. It's like Reb Zev, tell me, Reb Zev Chaim, what's a myth?
A myth is a foundational story.
Now,
it may or may not be historical.
And it may or may not be true, but that's not, in our culture, we go a myth, that's a myth. It's not true.
It's a culturally foundational story.
and it's that reveals a deeper truth
Which is what
About-
makes it foundational.
about the human spirit. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the Akedah as a myth. You still with me? I'm building this slowly, but I still got enough time. So here we go. What's midrash? Somebody else. What's midrash? Julie, what's midrash? Oh, a myth is a deeply true story. Okay, I got that. What's midrash? Let me give that. Come
Someone
on,
want to answer?
I'm not letting you sleep through this. Michelle put up her hand. I can unmute, ask you to unmute. And
Hi. Midrash is like interpreting the story. It's creative, reading into the story, drawing out the meaning, searching for a hidden deeper meaning and not changing the outcome of the story.
and it's legend, it's Jewish legend. Okay, so what I want to say about midrash, which I learned from some years ago, is midrash is what happens between the beginning of between the end of one sentence in Torah and the beginning of the next sentence, right? Midrash is what happens between the end of one sentence in Torah and the beginning of another sentence in Torah. So that's the function of midrash. Okay, here's the problem we need to midrash comes along to resolve a problem. So here's the problem with regard to the story of the binding of Isaac that midrash tries to resolve. Okay, Julie, if we were reading it, we would come across this sentence. Could you please read it?
Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and put it on his son Isaac.
Okay, intro to the story. Then, as the story ends, we get this.
Abraham then returned to his servants, and they departed together for Beersheba.
Okay, folks, what's the problem? Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and put it on his son. Abraham then returned to his servants, and they departed for Beersheba. I'm just reading you two psukim, two verses from the text, and I'm suggesting there's a problem there.
What happened to Isaac?
What happened to Isaac?
Right.
Okay? Now, not only is that a problem, but the next parsha, the very next parsha, begins with the following. Julie is our reader. Her reading is good, but her writing of Torah is even better. She's a soferet. Go.
Sarah died in Kiryat Arba, which is Hebron in the land of Canaan, and Abraham came to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her.
Okay, thank you. So, if you were one of the folks who wrote midrash, or you were one of the folks that were reading the Torah and looking to understand the contradictions or the potential conflicts, what would be the conflicts that we would have to resolve? Somebody said it before the first one. We have a hand up that we need to put your hand up, so we'll unmute you. Okay, go. Pablo.
Probably the death or maybe death of Isaac caused the death of Sarah.
Well,
She died of a broken heart.
so let me, that's where the midrash goes, but let me, the question of midrash is what happened to Isaac on Har Moriah, on Mount Moriah, that she died. So that's one question. And the other question is what happened to him? Abraham takes him up, and there's nobody, and he only comes down with his servants. Okay, Judy Kern, are you just waving at me? You're talking to somebody else on the phone. Okay, anybody else have a comment, a question? Okay, TC McLeod, that's a great name. I love it. Go. You've got to unmute yourself. Let's ask to unmute. Okay, go.
Okay. Theory is that Isaac died, that Abraham didn't, because the portion opens with Abraham being called once, where Hashem calls Abraham and says, Abraham. And Abraham responds, Hineni, here I am. By the time they get to the Akedah, Hashem or whoever, whatever, has to call twice before getting a response. So
Okay.
the midrash is that Abraham did kill him.
So we don't know what the question really is. We now need to study what happens to him on Mount Moriah, on Har Moriah. Okay, Julie, could you put the texts in the chat so folks
Yes,
could?
I will do that now.
Okay, this is your party favor. Okay, it's a PDF file of subtexts. Okay. So this is what Abraham's ascent up the mountain and is followed by Sarah's death. So the questions that the midrash asks are, where was Isaac and what happened to Sarah? So that's what we're doing next. Okay, please read.
When the Holy One, blessed be he, said to Abraham, offer him up as a burnt offering before me. Abraham came home and said to Sarah, how long is your son Yitzchak to hang onto your apron strings? Is he not, after all, 37 years old? Come now, fix provisions for our journey, for he and I are off to the great study house.
Okay, so first of all, he's like the 37-year-old millennials today. They're living in their parents' basement. They're sleeping on a couch in their parents' basement. So he's saying, come on, the kid's sleeping in the basement. He's 37 years old. So he takes him to where? Put it in the chat. Put your hand up if you want me to unmute you. This is an important piece that will define the myth. So let me put it back up here. Okay. He's 37. Fixed provisions for our journey, for he and I are off to the house of the great study. The house of the great study is the location of spiritual initiation. Okay, looking at the screen, a few of you are a few years past 37. But in a mythic sense, 37 to 40 is sort of that midlife transition where one goes beyond their ego personality into more of a spiritual awareness. Reb Zev Chaim, can you read this, Julie? You're better off in the chat than I am.
Reb Zev Chaim says, Isaac is so traumatized by his father's attempt to kill him that he totally absents himself. Today we would call it PTSD.
I'm not, but okay, but I'm not. I want to Reb Zev Chaim. We've talked before. I want to disagree with that interpretation because I want to say that he's a willing participant in his own spiritual initiation. He's going to the yeshiva of Shem and Eber, which is symbolically he's going into a place of spiritual initiation. And in men's work, and today the mythic work says that at a certain point men need to go on, women do it in a different way, need to go on a vision quest. You know, the bar mitzvah has become more of an emphasis on the bar than on the mitzvah. But in Native American culture, they would send young boys out into the woods to spend an overnight there. And so in the midlife initiation, one develops a sense of one's own independence, one's own autonomy from one's own parents, and maybe one's own relationship to spirit and to God. And in that sense, it says in the Passover Seder, Chayav Adam lirot et atzmo ke'ilu hu yatsa miMitzrayim. Do you remember that? It is incumbent upon everybody to see themselves as if they left Egypt. Okay, and we do that in our Seders, you know, well, who's the Pharaoh, who were in slavery. But what would it mean to see ourselves as if we are Isaac on some journey of spiritual initiation? What would it be to see that we ourselves at this year, at this time, are in some ways going through some kind of transformation that we don't know where COVID is taking us, folks. We thought it was all going to be over and we were going to go home and we were going to be back at the beach, or we were going to be back in our jobs, or we were going to be back having our family around the table for Rosh Hashanah, and we don't yet know where it's going. We don't yet know where it's going. We don't know how it's changing us. We don't know how it's changing American culture. We don't know how the climate catastrophe that we're living in is changing American culture. In some ways, we are all Isaac. Our life is on the line, and we don't know exactly where it's going. Anybody want to comment on that? Because I think that's a little bit of an outrageous statement, but I'm willing to be a little bit outrageous. Anyone have any thoughts on that?
Linda Foyer?
Where's
You need
Linda?
to unmute yourself.
I was using my wife's invitation. I've got a contrary view, and it's contrary to just about all the possible interpretations of the Akedah. I have some
Do me
proofs.
a favor. Give me the short version, not the long version of the.
Okay, the version I have is Abraham is a gambler who gambles that God is bluffing.
Okay, so look, I want to honor that, and the mythic story looks for the allegory in the story. So I'm really trying to see what the allegory is for Isaac's experience, and in what way can we, because it's a Rosh Hashanah story, in what way can we, Erev Rosh Hashanah, draw from it?
Without giving you don't want to hear the proofs now, but the proofs are based on Abraham's actual story, his track record and actual experience. So I mean, I've got, if you'd like, I could put the proofs in the chat.
No. I'm talking about Isaac. So let me keep going. Okay, I hear you with all due respect, and I'm giving you a different angle on it. Okay, so
Elaine had her hand up.
Yeah, please go.
Elaine, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Thank you. I so appreciate bringing Isaac into it. So often I've been so upset that my rabbis have said it was the test and Abraham didn't pass it. So we're not even going there. In other words, to think that we could be Isaac, for me, sits so well. I got married when I was 38 and started the spiritual journey, and here I am feeling so close to God. It's incredible. And most importantly is have to die, and there's some philosophy, die daily to our old selves. And this is the most dramatic dying that he could possibly have, to become close to God, because that's the whole issue. If we can say and believe that Abraham's faith is so great, that's what we might want for Isaac too.
So here's the question that I think we each need to ask ourselves this era of Rosh Hashanah, because it's the Rosh Hashanah story. As the new year approaches, what are the life cycle transitions that you are facing at this time? Like, what are the changes that you're going through? Where are you in your life? Are you going from, a lot of my friends are going from being, having kids at home to being an empty nester. Are you going from, I used to be able to walk 3 miles a day and now I need to go to the cardiologist? Are you going from I'm living in my own home, I got to go into assisted living? Or are you getting married? Or we're all in some kind of change or transition, looking like this guy in the picture, looking out into the unknown and not exactly sure where it's going. So that's the question that I want you to ask yourself, and to, because we can glean from this midrash. What we glean from this midrash here is that any transition is a developmental change that requires deep inner reflection. It's whether it's a time of crisis, transition, midlife, or not. In those moments of transition, one is forced back upon themselves. In times of adversity, you get to know who you are. You know, I also do counseling and psychotherapy, so I work with people who are dealing with times of loss in the family. And sometimes when you're sitting alone, or like people have been sitting alone in this pandemic for a while. Hello, Carmela. Hello, Carmela Egan. It's been a long time, and I'm glad that you're here. So when people go through loss, it changes them. So ask yourself, who's this person who has gone through this transition? Like who's the Isaac in you, and in what way are you a person who has deep resources and skills? Are you a person who consciously and easily moves through life changes, or do you resist? Do you say, no, I'm not going on, Daddy, I'm not going on the Akedah, and I'm not going through the changes, and I'm right? Or are you blown about by the winds of change, or are you in the driver's seat in your own life? So that's really what the tshuva process does. This is a tshuva story. It allows us to see, who am I? Will I be able to live my life in tune with my own vision? Will, like, maybe Isaac, will I be like my father, or can I live a different life? So the challenges of Yitzchak's life is to find his own place in the world. The challenge for each of us is to find our own place going through these times of changes. And just like Yitzchak, we have to create our own relationship with God, different from our own father. Anyone? I'll take a couple of comments. Short is good, but
Nancy,
I want to.
Goodwin?
Yes, I was going to say, I'm not sure which gentleman made the point that this was in a way Abraham arguing with God, or maybe calling his bluff, or not truly believing he was meant to kill his son. And one of the first books I ever read by Elie Wiesel was not about his experiences in the camp, but he had a series of portraits of biblical figures, or our patriarchs and our stories and so forth. That was his position, since Abraham had always argued with God, or had a history with God.
We're talking about Isaac. Let me stay with it. Okay. So I want to show you some more of the midrashim here. Okay. Because the question that the midrash asks is, what happens to Isaac at the Akedah? So here is another text. Okay, Julie's our reader.
And lo, when the knife touched Isaac's throat, his soul took wing at once and flew clean out of him. When Father Isaac was on the point of being sacrificed as a freewill burnt offering, he beheld the light of the Shekhinah, and his soul flew out of him, but the Holy Blessed One revived him.
Okay, you see these two texts here? These are not your ordinary texts, but what the midrash suggests is that on the altar at Mount Moriah, Isaac has what we call a near-death experience. A near-death experience is when people are pronounced clinically dead and later resuscitated. And today we have all of this biomedical technology, and people are they flatline. They're completely dead, and then they come back, and we hear about the tunnel and ancestral guides and beings of life. And all of these people come back with a different spiritual perspective. And in some ways, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are like a time of symbolic death. We die to our old selves and we reawaken to a new spiritual perspective. We live our lives with more intensity and more passion. And that's what we want out of our Rosh Hashanah this year. We want our Rosh Hashanah this year to help us be able to live our lives with more intensity and more passion. So the question that I think we need to ask ourselves is this one. Like Yitzchak, you are on the abyss between the known and the unknown. What are your questions? What are the challenges at this time of your life? Who am I right now, and who am I becoming? So that's what this text, seen through the eyes of Yitzchak, not Abraham. I know a few of you want to talk about Abraham, but I got an hour here because Julie's going to cut me off. I got an hour here to raise some questions that I think are helpful for each of you to think about. In what way is your life somewhere in the unknown? In what way are the old ways dying off? In what ways do you have to come up with something new that you don't quite know what it is? You know, I was talking to somebody earlier today, and they said because of COVID and because they had an injury, they're not going to continue their job. So what are you going to do? She said, I'm going to sit in the emptiness of not knowing and wait. And guess what? How many of you want to claim that you're really, really good at sitting in the emptiness of not knowing and waiting? Put up your hand if you are. I don't see very many people putting up their hands. How many of you are really good? How many of you learned how to do that? We want answers now. We want to be able to download it. We want to be able to put our credit card in a machine and get exactly what we need. Isaac was on the altar. As I'm jumping ahead, he didn't come back down for 3 years. I hope we can get out of this crazy time of craziness for less than 3 years. But there are moments in life when we don't know, and that's what this Rosh Hashanah is about for us this year. We don't know. I don't even know who's coming for dinner next week. Another comment, but don't comment on Abraham, please. I want to hear a comment on what I'm talking about. I want to hear a comment on the uncertainty of the moment of being of being on the altar.
Annette, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi. It reminds me, and I don't know if there is a connection between Isaac and Jesus, and the change that happened during that time that they were absent, as you call it, while they weren't here, and then they came back and they became who they became, which was probably for Isaac. He took more responsibility, he got married, he replaced his mother, and then he became the father of.
You have the perfect comment for 4 or 5 texts down the road, because as I'm going to show you, the rabbis. Okay, I'm jumping ahead, folks. Okay, but you'll bear with me, okay? Because Annette made a very astute comment. The rabbis end up saying that Isaac dies and he comes back, okay? And as if they're saying, you guys have somebody who died and came back? We also have somebody who died and came back. So, and then it gets used by the rabbis are the religious leaders of Judaism in the 2nd, 3rd, 5th century, which is around when Christianity is emerging in the world. Okay, in 323 or thereabouts, Constantinople becomes the center of sort of that ancient world, and Christianity becomes a dominant religion. And so the rabbis go, yeah, we also have somebody died and come back, but I'm not yet at that text yet. He hasn't died yet. Okay. Anyone else a comment? And then we're gonna swim in your comments, and then we're gonna swim in some more midrash.
Sarah,
Well, North, yeah, and the reality is we never really know what's going to happen next. That's the reality of our life, and that's what the holidays remind us of.
And most of us get lost in what's for dinner, or who was singing what where. We've gotten a lot better at reclaiming the spirituality of the Chagim. Okay. It's a little harder this year. I don't know. Some of you are going to be on Zoom. Some of you are going to be in congregations. I find that on Verizon Fios, the services coming from Central Synagogue in New York are always very inspiring when I don't go to synagogue. So let's go back to our text. So thank you. We obviously can have a lot of conversations on this, but this is moving towards what Annette was saying. Okay. Oh, did I go back? Okay. So now. Again, Julie, please.
When the sword touched his throat, his soul flew up into Gan Eden, and he beheld the soul of his mother Sarah, who had died in the interim, because Samael, the angel of death, had informed her that Abraham had already slaughtered Isaac, whereupon she let out a scream, and the soul departed.
Okay, so today it's fascinating. Today, people have these near-death experiences, or people are lying in their hospital dying, and they're going, "Oh, I saw my mother," or I had somebody who said she was sitting at her mother's bedside. The woman was dying. The woman looks up and says, "Oh, Mom, I never introduced you to my daughter." The dying woman has a vision of her deceased mother. Or Elizabeth Kubler-Ross tells a story of a man driving cross country, and he witnesses a hit and run. And he picks up the woman and she says, "I am from such and such an Indian reservation. Please go tell my mother I'm with father now." The guy drives 700 miles to find the woman and finds out that the woman's father, the woman who he's talking to, her husband, had died of cardiac arrest 1 hour before the traffic accident. The daughter had no way of knowing that. So what we see in this midrash is what we're seeing today replicated in these near-death experiences, but it's the sense that those beings that we know and love, that we think about when we do Yizkor, who do you imagine being there for you when when your time comes? When I told my mother, Mom, when she was near the end of her life, you might see her father, because her father had been killed in a traffic accident when she was a young girl. I said, "Daddy, I don't know. Daddy might be late. He probably got stuck at Home Depot," which is what my father always did. But there's another hand up named Lois, but let me do one more text here. Julie, I want you to read this next text, because this is a text from the Zohar, from the mystical commentary on the Torah.
Rabbi Shimon said, "So we have learnt that at the hour of one's departure from the world, their father, mother, and other relatives gather round, and one sees them and recognizes them, and likewise all with whom they associated in this world, and they accompany the soul to the place where it is to abide."
So who do you imagine being there to greet you when your time comes to make the transition to the world beyond? Because in a way, the whole period of Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, we draw close again to those people. In whether you think of it or not, it often brings up our earliest memories. What do you have? Some people have family memories. Some people sort of came to Judaism a little later in life. But when I think of Rosh Hashanah, I choke on very dry honey cake, So what we see in this text is a kind of a death, a sort of spiritual death and rebirth. Anyone? Where's Lois? Lois had a hand up.
Lois, where did you?
Yeah, she's.
What I wanted to say initially, when you were asking about Abraham, very quickly, when I was maybe 10 or so and hearing it, the rabbi reading it, and what it was among the whole story itself, I can hear the rabbi still saying, or God saying to Abraham, "Abraham, Abraham," and he answers, "Hineni." It was so loud and distinct. The story, like, you've got to stop. But what I want to say about Isaac is that I understood at one time, he wanted to make sure that he wouldn't move when to cut his throat. So he asks his father to tie him down. What is this?
Okay, if you go
mythically, he's tied to his mother, he's tied to his father.
Wait, I'm not doing this literally. I'm doing this mythically. So mythically, sometimes when we are tied down, oddly enough, that's when we grow closer to God. Sometimes when we can't move, Like I knew someone said, God gave me a stroke so I could lie on my back and get closer to him. When we're in the stuck place, that's often the place when we grow more spiritually. Noreen Freeman, you have a hand up? Let's see if we can ask you to unmute. Yeah, okay, go.
Two things. I really appreciate this conversation because that's why they call it an Akedah and not a slaughter. You know, I think that's really important in this whole discussion, is that what are you going to connect to and who do you relate to and that kind of thing. And the other comment I had is, Sarah, to me, she dies in peace. She fulfilled her mission. She was 127, which is plenty old. She lived a long life and she fulfilled her mission. Her son became bound to God, which to carry out the mission that they were originally intended to do. And I just feel that she died in peace in this trauma that somebody told her Isaac died. She was 127.
So in this mythic story, you see something about your own potential of fulfillment.
Right.
You know, we bring our own story to this story. Okay, I'm looking at my clock, and I want to make sure that I don't leave you stuck on the altar, or Julie will never invite me back here again. Okay, so please, Julie.
When Father Isaac was bound on the altar and his sacrificial dust was cast onto Mount Moriah, Holy Blessed One immediately brought upon him dew and revived him. Forthwith, the ministering angels began to recite Baruch Atah Adonai Mechayeh Hametim.
Whoops, sorry, I didn't go the right way. No, come on, go the right way. Here it is. Baruch Atah Adonai Mechayeh Hametim. Baruch Atah. So there are moments of death. So first of all, the rabbis, by the way, associate Abraham with the first blessing of the Shemona Esrei, of the sun standing prayer, and they associate Isaac with the second one, Mechayeh Hametim, and this is the whole theme of resurrection. This is what Annette was saying. Here they bring him back. He comes back to life, and this is exactly what's the parallel with moments of crises, or with midlife transition, or with those life transitions. We get reborn if we stay present to what our feelings are, what our disappointments are, what our sense of loss is, what our grief is, rather than avoid it and numb it out by watching hours of television or other ways we avoid it. We are able to experience a sense of spiritual rebirth. So this Rosh Hashanah, we want to bring our grief to the year. You know, my wife and I, we sit down on Erev Rosh Hashanah and we go through it month by month. In some ways, it was a lousy year. In some ways, it was a crappy year. Excuse the four-letter word. But if we recognize that and we let go of the grief, then perhaps we can be reborn and reclaim something new for the coming year. So hang on, I want to see what's coming up next. Oh yeah, just what I was talking about. So what are the old ways that are dying off for you, and what are the new ways that are being born? Are you holding on, or are you letting go? What would your life be like if you allowed the old ways to die? And what is your vision of being reborn? What is a reborn way of being in the world? See, I think that's the question that the Akedah invites us to ask. Not, was Abraham abusive? No, but in what way are we going through a time of death and rebirth this year? What is 2021 or 5782 bringing to us? And what's the old stuff of 5781 that we want to let go of, what we want to die off? Julie, one more.
All All right.
And then I'll go back to some questions.
What was he doing all that time in Gan Eden? They were healing him there.
So tradition teaches us that it took him 3 years. He spent 3 years on Har Moriah. And we learn from this that those kind of important transitions in our life do not take place quickly. That sometimes, hang on, I'm still sharing the screen. I want to stop sharing the screen. Sometimes it takes a while. The changes that we go through, the changes that we're going through individually post-COVID, the change that we're going through as a culture. If we were here 3 years from now, Erev Rosh Hashanah, and I said, what was your life like and what was life like in America and the world? If I asked you all to write it down, what do you think it's going to be like? 95% of us would be wrong because we have no clue where it's all going. When there are fires on the Pacific Northwest, and when there's earthquakes in Haiti, and when look what's happening right today in New Orleans, all of this stuff that's going on, I'm not a Debbie Downer. I'm simply trying to say that we don't know what's coming up next. We just don't. And the more humble we can be and recognize that we don't know, the more we can learn to be in the present and love the people around us, because that's really the take home of all of this. Not that we don't know where it's going, but that our task is to live more fully this year in the present, because we're always worrying about the future or regretting the past. Guess what? You can't change the past, and worrying the future isn't going to make it any better. We don't support the positive power of worry. Worry does not necessarily make the future better. Hafiz, the Sufi poet, said, now that all your worry has proven to be so non-lucrative, why don't you go find yourself another job? Now that all your worry has proven to be so non-lucrative, why don't you go find yourself another job? What's Wendy say? Could you read what there's something in the chat, Julie? Just the readings only say that the knife.
The readings only say that the knife touched Isaac's throat. So how can we assume he was killed and then brought back to life?
Because the midrashes took a lot of liberty. They had midrashic liberation. They could say whatever they wanted to. And again, it's not a literal story. It's a mythic story. It's a story that tells a deeper truth about in moments when we are stuck and tied up, our old self dies and something new is reborn. Okay. So here's the question that comes out of the last text, folks. And I still got 9 minutes before I don't want to leave you stuck on the altar. What's the healing that you need at this time in your life? And what do you need to do to be able to receive that healing? Right? So, because in times of uncertainty, Isaac is said to have spent 3 years healing on Mount Moriah. What's the healing that we need in order to go back into the world? Because we have spent 20 months, or 18 months, or whatever, I don't even know how long it's been, in some kind of bound up on the altar. And what do we need? What's the healing that we need to go forward? I need to lose my I need to go back to my pre-pandemic weight. That's what I need to do.
There's a question from Ronald in the chat. Can the concept of reincarnation be brought into the conversation of rebirth?
You can bring anything in with me. As a matter of fact, I wrote a book called Jewish Views of the Afterlife, and in my Kabbalah chapter, I have about 20 pages or 40 pages written on reincarnation. But actually, specifically, they're really talking about resurrection. They're talking about resurrection is returning to the same body, which is very different than reincarnation, which is the soul landing in another body. Okay. Another text or two, and then we'll come in for a landing. So, go, please.
Isaac remained on Mount Moriah for 3 years until he reached the age of 40, and then he married Rebecca.
Okay, so he's 40 years old. He enters the world healed and prepared to meet his fate, to meet his destiny. He meets his his partner. In the Jungian sense, it's sort of the wholeness of the psyche, the masculine, the feminine. But here's the story. We each have our own individual, unique destiny. And what way are you being called into the next steps of your own destiny? What is calling you? Because everybody has to ask themselves what it is that their Lord God asks of them. And it could be things large or small. It could be something to do with your body health. It could be something to do with relationships. It could be something to do with your home. It could be something to do with your prayer life. It could be something to do with meditation. It could be something to do with finances. We're all always being shepherded along by God, by the universe, by the forces of life and destiny into the next step of our lives. And what Rosh Hashanah does is we take a pause, and it gives us a chance to think about that. Not only to think about what's going to be on the menu or what you're going to wear, but rather who you are, how you are, and where you're going. And that to me is what I see when we read the story of the Akedah. So the question is this. What's the movie of your life? What transformation is awaiting you at this stage of the journey? That's what this story, and that's what Rosh Hashanah asks of us. Now, one more to pull it all together.
And it came to pass that when Isaac was old and his eyes were dim so that he could not see, he called Esau, his eldest son, and said to him, "My son." And he said to him, "Behold, here I am." And he said, "Behold, I am old now, and I do not know how soon I may die."
Right? So this is a little bit later in the story. He's basically saying, I want to give you a blessing because I don't know, I'm going to die. And what happens is he doesn't die. He lives on for a long time. You read more stories about Rebecca arranges for Isaac to be married, Jacob and Esau, Jacob's dream, the death of Rachel, and only at the end of chapter 35 do you hang on. Only I'm going to read to my notes, not that Isaac finally dies. But what we learn from him is that he lives his life with fullness. He says he's old and he's going to die. What he means is he recognizes that life is mortal. It seems to be hardwired into the human condition that people die. Okay, I hate to be a bummer and tell you stuff. I don't want to scare you, right? Ain't none of us getting out of here alive. Not today. Relax, folks, right? But Isaac, through his experience of the Akedah, he learned how to live life fully. Recognizing that life is finite, you may as well live to the fullness of your days. And I think that's the take home for us in this sort of time of pandemic or post-pandemic confusion. What we learned from Isaac is to live life fully. That's what we want to get out of our Rosh Hashanah this year. And maybe this Rosh Hashanah is going to give us a chance for more self-evaluation and reflection. Maybe we'll have a spiritual experience like Isaac to gently, the Akedah. Akedah is the binding of Isaac. But we have to keep...
Oh, I think they meant the Ayal, the ram.
The ram.
Someone asked if Isaac was sacrificed, why did they need to sacrifice the ram? Why did Abraham need to sacrifice the ram?
Well, midrash gives us the parallel story. So are we bound to our past or free to realize our potential? like Yitzchak, can we be healed from the traumatic abuses of our lives, and how will we be reborn to fulfill our destiny? And I think that's what I want to leave you with. In what way are you being called? So somebody just asked that Isaac literally died. Well, symbolically he died. Symbolically he died. So it's a symbolic story. It's an allegory, and I hope that you could see ways in which the allegory speaks to you in your life.